I'm Coleman Collins, registered dietitian nutritionist, and I'm with the National Peanut Board, and I'm going to be talking about preventing peanut allergies. In your folder, unfortunately, you have different slides. You have slides that were from Matt Greenhot, who's a fantastic researcher, an allergist, a pediatrician out of Colorado, who had a family emergency and was not able to join us. So I'm pinch hitting. I am not Matt Greenhot, but hopefully I'll be able to do justice to this topic and share with you some of the information that he was going to share, and maybe a bit of a different perspective as a registered dietitian. But we are going to talk about the LEAP study, which is the Learning Early About Peanut Allergies study that preceded the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease Guidelines on early introduction of peanut allergies, or peanuts. So that's a mouthful, but I'm going to make it simple for you, I promise. So you guys already know I'm a consultant for the National Peanut Board. These are our objectives. We're just going to run through them. And by the way, I will be happy to provide these slides for you afterwards. So don't worry about trying to write everything down. Feel free to take notes or ask questions, but don't worry about trying to capture every single thing that I'm sharing with you. I'm happy to share these with you afterwards. So as we think about infant feeding, I think that it's really important and helpful to start with a basic overview of sort of how do we normally feed infants and why is this an issue? Because I think a lot of times people don't know, or they don't understand, or they don't know where we've been, and that's pertinent to understanding where we are now and where we're going. So when we think about infant feeding, it's about sort of that early time period, right? It's birth through 12 months. That's the infant period. And the general agreement is that at least through the first 4 months or 6 months, depending on who you ask, 6 months is probably the more common number that you'll see, exclusive breastfeeding is recommended. That's the preferred way of feeding infants. If that's not possible, then an infant formula that's appropriately formulated for children is what's recommended in place of breastfeeding. So in general, no dietary restrictions are necessary for mom, either while she's pregnant or when she begins to breastfeed. So as long as mom doesn't have any issue, in general, there's no need to restrict her diet. If she has some issues, or if the baby has some issues, there may be the need, but in general, in the general population, we don't recommend any withholding, and that includes any allergen. So peanuts, tree nuts, and any of the other big 8, which we'll talk about. Complementary foods, and that's anything except breast milk or infant formula. That's a complementary food. Should begin at around 6 months. So there's no reason to delay feeding until after 6 months, and I can't tell you how many moms I've talked to who think they're supposed to breastfeed exclusively for 12 months. I don't know where this idea came from, but there are a lot of people who think that. In fact, complementary foods should start around 6 months. And in some cases, children might be ready before 6 months. It's really a little individualized. And when we think about public health messages, it's important to recognize that we're generalizing, and there are always going to be exceptions. And nutrition is a very specific, personalized kind of thing, and sometimes it's okay to start a little before 6 months. So we're thinking about developmentally, when is it time to start feeding a child? And that starts when a child can hold their head up on their own, right? When they've got some trunk control and they can start to sit up on their own. When they're starting to show an interest in food, right? I mean, my son started solid foods around 5 months. Let me tell you, he was ready. He was leaning in. He wanted that spoon. He was acting like he was eating. While I was eating in front of him, he would chew. He was showing me he was ready to start eating. He was very, very interested. So when we start feeding infants, it's important to start with simple foods, right? We want to start with simple, nutritious, iron-fortified cereals are a great place to start. Around 6 months, infants start to deplete their own iron stores, and breast milk is not a good source of iron. So starting with infant formula or infant cereals is a great place to start. Single ingredient foods, right? Simple things like fruits and vegetables, purees, appropriate to the child. I know that baby-led weaning is very popular right now, and that's also just fine. In the beginning, right, in those first couple of months, it's really just about learning to eat. It's not about nutrition so much. We're not replacing breast milk. We're not replacing formula in the very beginning. It's just about teaching a baby about texture and about what it feels like to have a spoon in their mouth, and what it feels like to chew, and what it feels like to move food around with your tongue. It's not really about nutrition, but a lot of people, I think, get hung up on this early feeding time, and it's really just about experimenting and having fun. But what we also know is that this is a critical window for beginning the process of teaching the immune system about food and what's safe and what might not be safe. So potentially allergenic foods can be introduced in this early period. In fact, once foods have been tolerated, once a baby's shown that they're pretty tolerant of most foods, and the foods that are being introduced are not showing any signs of allergy, we can begin the process of feeding them potentially allergenic foods. We need to make sure they're done in a safe form, right? So we're not giving whole peanuts, for example, to infants. We need to make sure that it's in an appropriate form. And we want to feed the baby early in the day. And this goes for peanuts, but it's also for any other sort of allergenic food. You want to start feeding the baby early in the day with the allergenic food. You don't want to wait until right before nap time or right before bedtime, because you want to be able to observe the baby after they've had that allergenic food. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the recommendations, but before we do, I want to just share with you what an allergy reaction looks like, because some people don't really know what they're thinking about or what they're looking for when it comes to thinking about a potential allergic reaction. I do want to also say that the vast majority of children are not going to be allergic to peanuts, right? We know that less than 2% of children have a peanut allergy. That means that 98% of children are not going to be allergic to peanuts. They're going to be able to eat peanuts and not have an issue. And I think that's really important when we think about giving the message of early introduction. The vast majority of kids are not going to have a reaction, so moms can feel pretty confident going into this. And there are some caveats that we'll talk about. But in an infant, we're looking for some of these objective signs of potential allergy. And it could be a little rash around the mouth or hives around the mouth or on the face. That's a pretty common sign of an allergic reaction. That said, not every allergic reaction involves hives. So children can have an allergic reaction that doesn't involve any hives at all. But it could be something like lip swelling. One of the important things to remember with babies and young children is that they can't tell us what's going on, right? So a baby can't say, my mouth feels itchy, or I feel like there's something stuck in my throat, which is what a small child might say, but an infant can't say that. So we're looking for some of these other signs. Some important things like excessive drooling, which is a challenge with a 4 or 5 or 6 month old baby, right? Because why? They're teething. They're already drooling like crazy. But you're looking for something that's more than what's normal for that child. A change in skin color, a wheezing, or a repetitive coughing. I mentioned that something feels like something stuck in my throat. A lot of times people who are having an allergic reaction feel like there's something stuck in their throat, and they may cough over and over to try to clear their throat, but really it's a little bit of swelling that's happening in the throat. So these are the things that we're looking for, recognizing that the vast majority of the time this is not going to be the case, but we want to prepare parents, especially if they've got a child that's at high risk. And so we'll talk about what high risk looks like. It is important to know that in those severe symptoms that I mentioned, like skin color change or that repetitive coughing or wheezing or any sort of lethargy that happens with a baby, 911 should be called. There's no reason to wait. It's an immediate reaction. We need to make sure that we respond quickly to protect that child. So let's dig into the LEAP study, y'all. This is super exciting stuff. So if you don't know much about the LEAP study, I hope I get you as excited as I am about it. So it was, what happened is that as researchers in the allergy world were starting to look at why are we seeing this increase in food allergies in general, they recognized that there was a distinct difference between two genetically similar populations of children in Israel and the UK. And these kids the children in Israel had 10 times fewer cases of peanut allergies than they did in the UK. What was the difference? Well, they quickly discovered that in Israel, these infants eat a product called bamba, which is a teething food. Do you guys know what bamba is? Yes. So for anybody who doesn't know what bamba is, it's actually, you see this little baby that's gnawing on this little Cheeto puff thing? That's what it is. It's a corn and peanut puff that sort of melts in the baby's mouth, and so babies were weaned on this food. It's a ubiquitous snack food that everybody in the family eats, but especially the babies. And every mom carries it with them, and every mom feeds it to their babies. And so these babies were being introduced to peanut foods very, very early, but in the UK, the recommendation was to wait 1, 2, 3 years to introduce potentially allergenic foods, including peanuts. So that was the aha, right? That was the aha that said, wait a minute, maybe we're doing this wrong. So in the LEAP study, what they did was they recruited 640 infants who were at high risk for the development of peanut allergies. And these children either had existing egg allergy or they had severe eczema. And they screened them for potential peanut allergy. And in some cases, those children were already allergic. So these children were like between 4 and 11 months old, and in some cases they had already, even though they'd never eaten peanut, they'd already developed a peanut allergy. And so those kids were excluded, and they ended up with 530 infants. And they randomized these kids to 2 groups, and they instructed them to either begin early introduction, eat peanut foods when they were enrolled, so between 4 and 11 months they started eating peanut foods, or they avoided peanut foods. And they followed these kids for 5 years. And they had great support. They got the support of registered dietitians. And they also had great retention and adherence. So these parents really were committed to the study, and they followed the protocol really, really well. And the outcome was a greater than 80% reduction in the risk of peanut allergy among the kids who ate peanut foods. So this was huge. They also discovered that it was safe. It was safe to introduce peanut foods to these infants. None of the children died, even the children who ended up with peanut allergy. Though there were some severe reactions, there were no deaths, which was encouraging because there was this great fear. What are we going to do? What's going to happen? Even though they knew in Israel it was safe, right? These babies were eating these peanut foods and they were not reacting at higher rates than expected. They also discovered that the infants' diets were nutritionally similar, but they were different. They were, the children who ate peanut foods early actually ate more fat, but they ate less carbohydrates. So they ate less snacky foods. You know, they ate less of those kind of foods that we might think of as filler foods. They also had similar growth. It was very feasible. So the recommendations following the protocol was very doable for the moms, which is a big deal, right? I mean, we don't want to make recommendations that people can't follow. And they were definitely able to do that in the LEAP study. So what was happening? What was happening that was changing the outcome for these infants? Well, the theory is that there's this dual exposure hypothesis. So what we know now is that there's protein in our environment everywhere, and that includes food proteins. Food proteins are in our environments. And in households where parents and families are eating peanut foods, there's peanut protein in the dust. There's peanut protein in your bed. There's peanut protein in your environment. And these infants who had severe eczema had broken skin, and our skin protects us, right? It's our largest organ. It protects us from the outside. But in these cases, these children had broken skin, and the protein was getting through the skin because of the eczema in general. This is the thinking. And so these kids were starting to develop sensitization, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in my next presentation. But for the purpose of this, they were being sensitized through the skin, and they weren't being exposed orally at all, right? So the body was thinking, this is a foreign thing, and I don't want this thing in me because this is a foreign thing. But when the children had oral exposure at the same time as that cutaneous exposure, they were developing tolerance. So by oral exposure, we're actually training the immune system that this is a safe thing. This is food. This is not bad. It's amazing to me that we're able to actually control that much of our immune system, but we are. So the LEAP study investigators were very interested in determining whether or not this truly prevented the peanut allergy or did it just delay the onset of the peanut allergy. Was it going to happen eventually anyway? So after the 5th year, with the children who had been in the EAT group, the group that had been eating peanut foods, they asked them to stop eating peanut foods for 1 year. And then they retested them at the end of 1 year to see what would happen if they stopped eating the peanut foods. Were they just delaying it? Well, what they discovered was actually, no. They actually had induced tolerance. The protection had been retained. So these kids became no more allergic than they did in the general population after that 1 year of withholding, which was great news. Of course, one of the things they did say was it was kind of hard for the kids to stop eating peanut butter. So that's good news, right? They fell in love with peanut foods, and it made it really hard for them to stop eating it. But in general, what they discovered was the protection was retained. So this always leads to the next question, right? What about other allergens? Well, that's where research is happening too now. We're trying to learn more about other allergens. Does this hold true for other allergens? It looks like in the research so far that early egg introduction is probably protective as well. Milk may or may not be protective. I think there's some disagreement. It looks like it's probably going to be protective, but I think we have to figure that out. Wheat before 4 months is a bad idea, but after 4 months, it's probably not a problem. In general, what we've discovered is that there's no evidence to support withholding for any of the allergens beyond 6 months to prevent allergies. So that's good news. We will talk a little bit more in my next presentation too about diet diversity, and I'm really excited about that area of research. So the other thing that happened was the same group said, okay, well, what about the other allergens? What happens if we do the same thing that we did with the LEAP protocol with all these other allergens? And they took 6 common allergens, and in the UK, sesame is a very common allergy, so they included that allergen as well. And they tried to introduce these foods in a group of children who were not at risk, right? So it was 6-month-old breastfed infants, and they enrolled all these kids, and they did the same sort of thing with the LEAP protocol. What they found was that it was safe. They had no major issues with safety, so it was safe to introduce these foods, but it was sort of difficult for the moms to get enough protein in to meet the protocol every week with all 6 foods. And if you've fed infants, you know that sometimes they will eat something and sometimes they won't eat something, and you get busy. And if you have other kids, it makes it even harder. So it was difficult to adhere to the protocol. But they did find that it was safe, that it didn't negatively impact things like breastfeeding or nutritional outcomes in general. So I think that the good news here is, again, this shows that it's okay to begin this introduction. We should be doing this. It's safe to do it. Whether or not it's protective, I think we'll see. We'll see. By the way, that's my son. All right. So all of this research now has changed the guidelines. So let's look really quickly at sort of what the history is. So in 2000, the American Academy of Pediatrics said to avoid the top allergens for 1, 2, or 3 years, depended on the allergen, right? And essentially that was based on expert consensus or expert opinion. It wasn't based on research. So in 2008, the AAP actually rescinded those guidelines and said, actually, the evidence doesn't support withholding, but they did not recommend introduction. So I think that's where some of the problem happened, that although they said the research didn't support withholding, they never said go ahead and feed these foods to your babies. And so most people, I think, still felt like the conservative thing to do was to wait to introduce. Now, fast forward, 2010, we got guidelines on the diagnosis and management of food allergies from the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, which are fantastic guidelines. If you're interested in allergies, it's a great place to go. And then in 2015, the LEAP study came out. The LEAP study was released, and right away after that fall, there was a consensus statement that was developed by all of the major allergen organizations around the world and the American Academy of Pediatrics, and they said, yes, we should be introducing peanut foods to infants. But they didn't give specific guidelines on how do we do it. So it took 2 more years, because, you know, science sometimes is slow. And then finally, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease released their guidelines on the introduction of peanut foods to prevent peanut allergies, and that's what we have now. There's also another report I'll talk about later. So these were all the groups that were involved in the consensus statement, and I'm not going to read this to you, but I included it so that when you get the slides, if you want them, then you'll have the resource and you'll have all that information. So now we have the NIAID guidelines, these new guidelines that tell us that we should be introducing peanut foods, and it tells us how, and it helps us to identify who are the children who are at most risk. So just like in the LEAP study, what the NIAID guidelines say is that the highest risk infants are those kids who have either egg allergy or severe eczema, or who have both. Those kids are considered at highest risk. And in advance of introducing peanut foods, those infants' parents should be discussing it with their pediatrician. So they need to talk to their pediatrician to determine, should we be testing our child in advance? Should we make sure they're not already peanut allergic before we begin the process of introducing peanut foods? And in some cases, those kids are going to need skin tests, and in some cases, those kids are going to need that first introduction of peanut foods in the office. So that's going to be our high-risk infants. That's going to be a small percentage of the population, right? Most kids are not going to fall into that category, right? Most kids, even though somewhere around maybe 20% or 25% of children might have eczema, most of those kids are not going to have severe eczema. So again, thinking about what is the risk factor, it's not just eczema, it's that severe eczema that makes the difference. So in these kids, once they're okay, once the doc says it's okay to go ahead and introduce, and they've had that first introduction, whether it's in the office or it's at home, these kids need to be eating, according to the LEAP protocol, 2 grams of peanut protein per feeding 3 times a week, for a total of 6 grams of peanut protein a week. So what is 2 grams of protein? It's going to be about 2 teaspoons of peanut butter, or about 2 teaspoons of powdered peanut butter. And I can give you some good, simple resources for that later, too. What about all the other kids? Well, the addendum guidelines went further, right? The LEAP study told us about these high-risk kids, but what the consensus of the expert group is that if this is protective in the high-risk group, what about all the other kids, right? A lot of kids who go on to develop food allergies don't have any known risk factors, right? So if this is protective in this high risk, they believe it will be protective in the rest of the population as well. So what they recommend is in this group 2. Group 2 is going to be kids who maybe have some moderate risk, right? So these are kids who have moderate to mild eczema, no known egg allergy, no other food allergy that we know of. And in these kids, the recommendation is not necessary to discuss with a pediatrician, but they can if they want to, right? Some parents are going to be nervous, and it's okay for them to discuss it with their pediatrician. They should introduce it home at or after 6 months. And I don't know if I mentioned this, but in group 1, the recommendation is that you introduce peanut foods as early as 4 months. So between 4 and 6 months is the recommendation for that highest risk. For the other kids, it's 6 months or after. So that's group 2. And then group 3 is these kids that have no known risk, right? Low risk, no, they don't have any allergy, they don't have any eczema. In these kids, the recommendation is that we introduce it home, and we introduce it around 6 months or after. And in accordance with the family's preferences, right? In general, we want to make sure that we're always suggesting that we're introducing foods in accordance with the family's preferences. All right. So this I stole from Matt's presentation because I thought that it actually provided a great kind of overview of, again, thinking about the NIAID risk, that's the severe eczema, egg allergy, and then a specialist is recommended to help with those highest risk kids, right? What's not considered a risk is infants who have parents with allergies. That's not considered in the NIAID guidelines. I get a lot of questions about what if they have a sibling, what if they have a first-degree relative? Well, the NIAID guidelines don't identify that as a high-risk infant if they don't have the other risk factors. What about other food allergies? So egg allergy is what's identified with NIAID, nothing else, because that was what was used with the LEAP protocol. And then infants who don't have severe eczema, so even if they have moderate eczema, they're still not considered to be at high risk. All right, but all this great research is out. We have these new guidelines, and yet there's still a challenge. It's still a problem, and part of the reason is because what we've seen in our research with the National Peanut Board is that among consumers, there's still a lot that they don't know. They still don't know about these guidelines. In fact, somewhere around, I think 40%, or I can't remember the number, of millennial parents, and this is the group that we're trying to target because those are the ones who are having young infants and children right now. They've not even heard about the guidelines. And if they have heard about the guidelines, they have a lot of questions. And when they hear about the guidelines, they have a lot of questions, and that's where we need your help. That's where you come in, right? They need more information. They want to understand, why did the guidelines change? In some cases, they ask, well, if you were wrong last time, are you sure you're right this time? Sometimes people ask, well, how can we change just on one study? But the reality is that the rigor of this one study was enough to change the recommendations. So we need to be confident, and we need to share this information with them. And then Matt and his team actually did a study of parents, and they found that many parents are still concerned about early introduction, right? They're still nervous about early introduction of any allergenic food, not just peanut foods. And so we need to help them feel confident about that. Most parents are unwilling to have screening tests done on their infant younger than 12 months old. So if they've got a child that falls into that high-risk category, many of them are afraid to do skin testing or blood testing. They don't want to subject their child to that. But the reality is, if they don't get screened and they don't introduce, and they are in that high-risk category, they're effectively doubling their risk for development of peanut allergies. So it's a huge intervention, and we need to encourage them. The other thing is that even among pediatricians, there's still some hesitancy. So an early study that was done last year found that only 11% of pediatricians are enacting the NIAID guidelines completely. So they still have a lot of questions. They're still unsure about it. And then there are some other things to be considered with implementation, right? So implementing the guidelines can be kind of challenging, especially when we think about screening that high-risk population. Not all infants are being screened properly, and some early research has shown this to be the case. The other thing that's a real challenge is there can be a significant lag time between the time that an infant is identified as at risk and the time that they see a specialist for additional testing. And that can take as much as 3 to 6 months, or 1 to 2 months, so 30 to 60 days before they get in to see a specialist for that additional testing. And in that 1 to 2 months, what can happen? They can become allergic. So I think it's really important that we get this going. So when I think about the dietitians in the room and the media persons in the room, what can we do? How can we help with this? Well, as dietitians, I think we can really help parents understand the research. And as health writers, as health influencers, we can help parents understand the research. We can guide them according to the research with early introduction by helping them understand what it says. And we need to encourage confident feeding behavior. I think, to me, that's what I'm most passionate about. It's like, as a mom and as a dietitian, I want people to feel comfortable feeding their babies, not being afraid. And I think that we should be responding to potential allergens in an evidence-based way. And for the dietitians in the room, there's some additional resources I'll share with you in the next presentation. As far as the media goes, there are some great opportunities for sharing these guidelines. And a lot of people think, and we've done some media work where, some of the media personalities said, well, this story's already been told. Well, in some way it has been told, but people still don't know, right? So consumers need to hear this message more than once in order to understand the change happened, in order to understand why it happened, and then in order to begin to take action. So the other thing is sharing context. I mentioned the AAP guidelines having changed in 2008. This is old news from the perspective of not withholding allergens, but many people still didn't get that message. And then helping to share the information about early introduction by using our websites. These are great resources. Peanutallergyfacts.org is one. Then preventpeanutallergies.org is the second, and Bob mentioned those. I think those are really helpful. These are some screen grabs from the preventpeanutallergies.org website. It is beautiful. It's also really user-friendly. It has a great little Know Your Child's Risk section on it. It's very easy to interact with. It's easy to use. It's easy to understand. So I encourage you to check that out. And then this is a really great PDF and handout that's available on the Peanut Allergy Facts website that has 5 easy ways to introduce peanut foods to your baby. Super simple. We tried to keep it really, really simple. And why is this so important? At the end of the day, I love this quote from Anthony Fauci, who's the director of the NIAID, and he said, we expect that widespread implementation of these guidelines by healthcare providers, and I would add health influencers and media personalities, will prevent the development of peanut allergy in many susceptible children and ultimately reduce the prevalence of peanut allergy in the U.S. And that is why this is so important. This is my contact information. You can ask me questions now, or in the essence of time, I'm not sure if we should go ahead and move on. You tell me. Okay. Okay, Carlene, I think I saw yours first.
So I have a question. With the advent of the peanut-free lunch breaks / school thing that's happening, do you believe if you disseminate this information and other people disseminate the information about early introduction correctly, we can see a switch back to the less regulated peanut-free schools?
That's a great question. I'm actually going to talk a little bit about schools in my next presentation, but for now, I would say yes, I hope so. I mean, I think if we see a reduction in peanut allergies, if you imagine that in these high-risk infants, there was an 80% plus reduction in peanut allergies. Can you imagine if that happened? That would be amazing. I mean, less than 2% of children have a peanut allergy now, but if we could get that under, 0.5% or something, that would be incredible. I think that the more people learn about safely managing peanut allergies in school, the more confident they are in serving peanut foods, regardless of whether there are children in the environment who have peanut allergies or not. But yes, I think that this is great news that takes away some of the fear factor around peanuts and shows that peanuts are actually a super nutritious food, and we actually need to be eating them sooner and more often, which is great. And somebody else, yeah, Toby, hey.
So the stat you had with the pediatricians, it was pretty shocking since it came out 10 years ago. So they're obviously the first front to the parent. The parent trusts them. So what is being done in order to educate that population? Because obviously that's different than media or national.
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me just clarify that stat, the 11% are following the NIAID Guidelines, which are the new guidelines that came out in 2017. So they haven't had that much time to understand those completely, but it's still groundbreaking, huge information. And these are pediatricians, so these are first line working with infants, so they should know this. You know, I know that the American Academy of Pediatrics is actively working to educate their members. We are actually working with the American College of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology and with the Food Allergy and Anaphylaxis Connection team in this new campaign that we have, the PreventPeanutAllergies.org campaign. And it has a component that's reaching health influencers, and we're working with Justin Baldoni. Do you guys know who he is? From Jane the Virgin. And he's doing some fantastic consumer outreach with us as well. And we're working with a number of other health influencers to get this message out to their audiences. So we're working on both fronts. I think, you know, the health orgs are working to educate their population. We're helping to educate dietitians and other influencers as well as consumers with the hope that they'll meet in the middle, right? And that as consumers understand this and they embrace this, they're going to also educate their providers as well. Great questions. Yes?
I'm not sure if this is outside of the scope of your talk, but I was curious if there's any research to support introducing peanuts through the mother for nursing, for breastfeeding, and how that might impact risk of allergy in the offspring.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there is research that shows that moms who eat more peanuts more often when they're breastfeeding actually reduce the chance of their child being peanut allergic. Same thing for tree nuts. Yeah. But I think that the oral introduction, again, it's like, you know, we know that peanut protein can pass through the breast milk, and this is oral introduction, right? So if we're doing oral, the thing is, if you do that early introduction through breast milk and then you don't do complementary feeding with peanuts, that might increase the risk. So we need to make sure that it gets into the diet early and then it stays in the diet. Yeah. All right. Any other questions?